Next, we have with us Ms. Sheryl Owen with her session SDG13 Strategic Review of Environmental and Social Integration for Advancing Sustainability. Ms. Sheryl Owen is the founder and CEO of Surrounded by Opportunities. She created this company out of her passion for creating a sustainable environment where everyone can thrive. With her background in civil engineering and experience in the construction and architecture industries, she has first-hand experience in the processes required for the successful implementation and execution of ambitious climate action goals. Cheryl's mission as a sustainability professional is to demonstrate the gaps that exist between company goals, project goals, and the people it impacts. Over to you, Ms. Sheryl Owen, for your session, SDG 13, Strategic Review of Environmental and Social Integration for Advancing Sustainability.
So thank you everyone for joining me here today to talk about strategic review of environmental and social integration for advancing sustainability. And as a partner stated, I work predominantly in the built environment, helping my clients really understand what are the overlaps that exist, not only from a climate action standpoint, but also all of the other SDGs and how they're intertwined. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that process based on some of my past experiences, and hopefully you can leverage this as a way to intertwine other aspects of the SDGs, including, of course, what most companies are essentially committing to, focusing on climate action and net zero emission goals. So one of the biggest issues that we oftentimes see in this process around whether we want to set climate action goals or any other components associated with the impact that it has on the social impact it has on communities and their supply chain, the reason why we're oftentimes stuck is because we haven't really defined our why or our purpose for a lot of the work that we're doing, right? So even sometimes when I talk to some clients and I say, well, what is the purpose for you actually creating a CSR, right? And they say, well, we want to address climate change, greenhouse gas emissions. And then from there, we can say, okay, what are other things that we can implement that aligns with that purpose? Because I oftentimes see it as like a feedback loop, essentially, right? So this graphic is from Putting the S in ESG, which was a report done by NYU Business of Stern. I'm going to walk through essentially how I create metrics for projects. And then following that, we're looking at how we're going to do it, what are the different strategies that we can implement, or what the frameworks that exist that aligns with that impact, right? So for example, if a company is only interested in a transparency report, then maybe a CDP reporting or carbon disclosure project framework is a good stepping stone for them. But if a client is saying, well, we want to be in alignment with climate science, then maybe the science-based targets, the SBTI, is the better option for them. What's great about the science-based targets is that it tells you what is your emissions for Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, and what should the target be each year until 2030 and subsequently 2050. And then, of course, after that, you implement the strategies, whatever they may be, whatever you and your team come up with. And then this is where a lot of companies get stuck when they're communicating their climate action goals or social impact goals. They're just pushing out the numbers or the data in a report. And unfortunately, there's no connection back to their impact, right? So that feedback loop of what I always focus on and I talk about, we get stuck in just collecting information and pushing it out in a way that people don't understand that to connect back to our story. So that's one thing I really enjoy doing, is helping my clients essentially storytell in sustainability, like what does that look like for them. So there's so much overlap. I'm going to talk about a couple of projects that I've worked on where we not only focus on SDG 13, of course, that's where it started. That was how the conversation started, right, around greenhouse gas emissions. But there are other aspects that the company would be able to align with and to support, so including SDG 7, 10, 17, maybe even 11 when we're talking about buildings. I feel like most companies, you have an opportunity to essentially align with multiple aspects of the SDGs. However, there is a need for more education around what the SDGs mean, right? Because a lot of companies, unfortunately, they're defining their own metrics that don't align with the intent of the SDGs. So I always go back and say, well, what is the intent of this SDG, and does that strategy align with it? I once had a client who wanted to focus on SDG 6, and their way of addressing, quote unquote, addressing SDG 6 is by using low flow fixtures, right? And I had to tell them, no, that's just not how this works. That's not the intent of what this SDG is about. There are other opportunities for you to consider aspects of green chemistry and the impact that it may have if it was for a pharmaceutical company. If anything goes down the drain, like what are those conversations happening, right? So you have to just have bigger conversations with them. So unfortunately, a lot of the metrics that we focus on evaluate what is the most convenient for us rather than what is the most meaningful. And again, using those frameworks and identifying which one aligns with your purpose is the best way for getting your clients on board. Right. So starting off with a project, it's a new building project. I wanted to consider, reduction in energy and therefore also tracking their greenhouse gas emissions. And I was telling them for SDG 7, there may be other opportunities because it's right next to a neighborhood area, a suburbia, right? And there was also a huge parking lot. I was like, why can't we just cover this with some solar panels? Why can't we, think outside the box where we are looking for other financial avenues as well? I'm going to talk about that a little bit for projects, because most clients are just going to increase their budget and they can't get an ROI within the time frame that they're looking for. It's a no-go oftentimes. So this was a graphic done by SE for All, and I love that they kind of highlight the 4 areas that they're looking at. Of course, 3 interconnection with other SDGs, right? So we're talking about SDG 13 initially around climate action and greenhouse gas emissions. However, of course, being very clear with your client of like what exactly they want to measure, right? Most of them, of course, if you're in a building, focuses on SDG, focuses on scope 2 emissions. But as we all know, your scope 3 emissions really need to be honed in on in order for you to say that you're going to achieve any ambitious climate action goals. Okay, so next is SDG 10, reducing inequalities. So when we're talking about reducing inequalities, especially when we talk about buildings, I always say there is energy burden, there's energy insecurity, and being that we were right next to an area that had some housing, we're saying, well, how do we know that they are not experiencing any kind of energy burden during the winter, right? And oftentimes when you're in buildings that are are abandoned, you are going to be spending more money on your energy bills compared to your counterparts. So that's another way of aligning with SDG 10, and then of course any kind of resiliency. Another aspect is what are opportunities for you to collaborate with other organizations that can essentially leave no one behind as we're transitioning to a green economy, right? So here in New York, I'm in New York, the city has a program where, anyone who wants to be who's interested in renewable energy and how to install solar panels, they can be a part of that if they're on a NYSERDA project, which is just a local New York housing organization. And then I always like saying, okay, what's the current state of how we're defining these metrics that are on the market at the moment, but then how do we push it further by looking at others outside of our immediate boundaries? So when we're talking about decarbonization, we're predominantly talking about energy performance or carbon performance. Here in New York, there is something called Local Law 97, where a lot of buildings are going to get penalized if their emissions exceed a certain threshold. So you're seeing a lot more people focusing on energy performance. But of course, the loophole is when you're saying that we want to achieve net zero, but then we do that by buying green power or carbon offsets. And that's one thing about science-based targets, right? One of the requirements is you are going to submit to the Science-Based Targets framework, you're not allowed to take credit towards your net zero goals or your threshold goals by buying green power and carbon offsets. And then, of course, the greenhouse gas emissions, is it really aligned with climate science, right? If you're saying that you want to essentially align with climate science, make sure that the framework you select aligns with that. Social impact, predominantly everything focuses on DEI. We're looking at employees, but think about how a more comfortable space, right, within buildings can actually support their productivity. There's also the community aspect. Currently, we're not really engaging people in the social sciences. Why is that? People in the social sciences, they have that information already. And then the supply chain assessments, if any, is done. We focus on the first and second tier, but even then, we're not setting thresholds for them. Currently, we're in a situation where we're just focusing on transparency. There's also, I'm going to touch on this really quickly, I think I'm over time, but essentially there's other opportunities for you for like peer-to-peer energy trading or local energy trading that comes along with it. And then I like always creating like a little matrix of what's really happening on projects. So is there a reliable energy source? Is there opportunities for resiliency, right? So climate mitigation and climate adaptation, and then a way for you to support the local individuals within that community. And then there are always financial avenues that I present to clients, right? So power purchase agreements or virtual power purchase agreements, if that's the route you choose to go. And then there are also sometimes there are rebates if you sell your energy back to the grid or to a local community, which they also had. So just as a quick wrap up, always reassessing our decisions. Is it contributing to gentrification or green mining? Is in alignment with the purpose? After upgrades has occurred, what percentage of the existing community has remained with clean access to energy, right? So that's another question that you can ask yourself. Do I even know within the community what are the underserved or marginalized communities and what are their obstacles? And then also making sure that you're pushing your clients or your competitors to be their best. And there's so many commitments happening, but when you're looking at, deeper down into it, it's very superficial still. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sheryl, for that wonderful session. Let's now, thank you for joining us. And let's now move on to